The stars above the Korean peninsula looked the same as they always did on that cold Tuesday night. But they were not the same. Something was hiding between them, something enormous, something hungry, and it was falling toward Earth at a speed no human machine had ever reached. Yuna was sitting alone in her small office at the Korean Aerospace Research Institute in Daejeon. She had a cup of cold coffee next to her keyboard, and 3 monitors filled with satellite data. She was tired. She had been working since morning, tracking a strange signal that had appeared 2 days ago at the edge of the solar system. At first, her team thought it was a glitch. Then it moved. Then it multiplied. Now there were over 300 objects, and they were heading straight for Earth. She was about to call their supervisor when every screen in the building went black. Not just hers. Every satellite feed, every data stream, every communication relay tied to orbit simply stopped. The lights in the hallway flickered. Her phone buzzed once and then died. Yuna sat in the dark for 5 seconds, her heart beating hard, and then the emergency power kicked in and bathed the room in dull red light. 600 kilometers above her, the Velshi Armada dropped out of faster-than-light travel and spread across Earth's orbit like a net made of metal and fire. There were over 400 ships. The largest ones were carriers, each one the size of a small city, covered in dark plates of alien armor that reflected no sunlight. The smaller ones were fast attack cruisers and troop transports, already angling their noses toward the planet below. On the bridge of the flagship, Commander Rotan stood at the center of his command circle and watched Earth fill the viewing screen. He was tall, even for a Velshi. His exoskeleton was pale silver, almost white, and his 4 eyes moved independently as he scanned the tactical displays around him. He had done this 11 times before on 11 different worlds, and every single one of them had surrendered before the second day. He clicked his mandibles twice, a sign of satisfaction. "Begin the broadcast," he said. The message hit every remaining communication system on Earth at the same time. It came through radios, televisions, cell towers, emergency frequencies, even old shortwave sets that hadn't been used in decades. The voice was flat and machine-translated, broken in grammar but clear in meaning. It said, "People of this planet, you are now under the authority of the Velshi Expansion Command. Do not resist. Resistance will result in the destruction of your population centers. You have 1 rotation cycle to surrender your governments." The world did not surrender. Instead, it panicked, and then it got angry. In Seoul, deep beneath the streets of Yongsan, there was a bunker that most citizens did not know existed. It was old, built during a time when the threat came from the north, not from the sky. Now it was full of generals, intelligence officers, and communication specialists, all shouting at each other while screens flickered with static and confusion. Taeho walked into that chaos like a man walking into a familiar room. He was 61 years old, retired from the Air Force for 3 years, and he had been pulled from his apartment in Busan by 2 soldiers who told him the president had requested him personally. He still wore his civilian jacket. He had not had time to change. He sat down, said nothing for 2 minutes, and watched. He watched the satellite footage that was slowly coming back online through backup systems. He watched the alien ships descend through the clouds over Central Asia, over Africa, over the American Midwest. He watched the first Velshi dropships touch down on flat, open ground, and he watched thousands of alien soldiers pour out of them in tight formations. The Velshi were fast. Their bodies were built like insects crossed with birds, thin and angular, with long limbs and joints that bent in strange directions. On the footage from other worlds, intercepted from the Velshi's own unencrypted transmissions, they moved like liquid, covering ground in great leaping strides. They were terrifying. But Taeho noticed something. He leaned forward in his chair and squinted at the screen. The Velshi soldiers on Earth were not moving like the ones in the intercepted footage. They were slower. Their steps were shorter. Their formations were looser, almost sloppy. One soldier near the edge of a landing zone stumbled and had to catch itself with one of its upper limbs before it fell. A general next to him was arguing about launching a nuclear strike on the nearest landing site. Taeho ignored him. He rewound the footage and watched it again. Then a third time. 300 kilometers away, Yuna was watching the same footage on a backup terminal that one of her colleagues had managed to connect to a military feed. She had already pulled up the navigational data she had decoded from the alien signals 2 days ago. She had the mass of the Velshi homeworld. She had its radius, and now she had its surface gravity. She did the math 3 times because she could not believe the answer. The Velshi came from a moon called Opus, a cold, rocky world orbiting a gas giant in a system far from Earth. Opus had a surface gravity of 0.31 g, less than a third of Earth's. On their homeworld, the Velshi were light, fast, and deadly. They could leap great distances. They could run at incredible speed. Their hollow bones and thin exoskeletons were perfectly designed for a world that barely held them down. Earth's gravity was 9.8 meters per second squared. For the Velshi, stepping onto Earth's surface was like strapping weights to every part of their body. Every bone, every organ, every joint was under 3 times the stress it was designed for. They were not just fighting humans. They were fighting the planet itself. Yuna grabbed her phone, found that it was dead, and ran down the hallway to find a working landline. She had to reach someone in the military. She had to reach someone who would listen. In the bunker, Taeho was still staring at the screen. He had not done the math yet. He did not have the data Yuna had. But he had 40 years of military experience, and his instincts were screaming at him that something was wrong with the enemy. Something fundamental. He watched another Velshi soldier stumble on flat ground and thought, "Why are you so slow?" Above them all, Rotan sat on his command bridge and waited for Earth to kneel. He did not know it yet, but he had just made the worst mistake in the history of the Velshi expansion. He had landed his army on the heaviest habitable world any of them had ever touched. And gravity does not negotiate. By the 3rd day of the invasion, the Velshi had established forward bases across 4 continents. From orbit, the operation looked like a success. Landing zones were secured. Supply lines were forming. The flags of the Velshi Expansion Command flew over 37 locations around the globe. Commander Rotan reviewed the reports from his bridge and found them acceptable. But the reports were lying. Not on purpose. The officers writing them were too proud to tell the truth. The truth was that the Velshi army was dying, and not a single human bullet had caused most of it. On the ground near Chaerwan, just south of the old demilitarized zone, Sergeant Dohan crouched behind a destroyed concrete wall and watched a Velshi patrol move through an empty village. There were 8 of them, walking in a loose line between burned-out houses. Their plasma rifles were held low, their heads turned slowly, scanning for threats. They looked dangerous. But Dohan had been watching them for 20 minutes, and he had noticed things. The alien at the front of the line was limping, not from a wound, but from exhaustion. Its legs shook slightly with every step, the way a man's legs shake after climbing a mountain. The one behind it kept stopping to adjust its grip on its weapon, as if the rifle was too heavy. A third one near the back had sat down twice in the last 10 minutes and had to be pulled up by the others. Sujin, Dohwan's combat medic, was lying in the dirt next to him, with binoculars pressed to her eyes. She whispered, "They look sick." "They're not sick," Dohwan said. He did not know why he was so sure. He just was. There was something about the way they moved, the way they fought against every step, that reminded him of the time he had trained at high altitude in the mountains, and his body had screamed at him to stop. "They're heavy," he said. Sujin looked at him like he was crazy. But she did not argue. She had learned not to argue with Do-won's instincts. They hit the patrol 10 minutes later. Do-won's squad was small, only 9 soldiers, armed with standard rifles and 2 grenade launchers. The Velshi plasma weapons were terrifying, bright bolts of blue-white energy that could melt through a vehicle door. But the aliens were slow to aim, slow to turn, slow to drop to cover. One of them tried to leap behind a wall, and barely cleared the ground before crashing into its shoulder first. Its exoskeleton cracked on impact, and it did not get up. The firefight lasted 4 minutes. 5 Velshi died. The other 3 tried to run. They could not run. They managed a heavy, stumbling jog that a fit human could have matched at a walk. They had learned what they needed to learn. 300 kilometers south, in the emergency bunker beneath Seoul, Taeho was on the phone with what was left of the Global Military Coordination Network. The Americans were reporting the same thing. So were the Europeans, the Indians, the Australians. The Velshi were strong in firepower, but weak in movement. They tired quickly. They broke easily. Something was fundamentally wrong with them on Earth, and nobody could figure out what it was. Then Yuna's call came through. It had taken her almost 2 full days to reach anyone with authority. Phone networks were destroyed. Internet was gone. She had eventually walked 12 kilometers to a military checkpoint outside Daejeon and convinced a young lieutenant to connect her to the command bunker through a field radio. The connection was terrible, full of static and cutting in and out, but her voice was clear enough. She explained it simply, because there was no time for complexity. The Velshi came from a world with less than 1/3 of Earth's gravity. Their bodies were designed for lightness. On their homeworld, they weighed almost nothing. On Earth, they weighed 3 times what they were built to handle. Their hollow bones were fracturing under their own body weight. Their organs were being compressed. Their circulatory systems were failing because their hearts were not strong enough to pump blood against Earth's pull. Every second they spent on the surface was killing them slowly. The bunker went quiet. Generals who had been arguing about missile strikes and nuclear options stared at the speaker on the table. Taeho leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. For the first time in 3 days, a knot in his chest loosened. "How long can they last?" he asked. Yuna hesitated. "If they stay on the surface, their bones will begin to fail within 2 weeks. Organ damage will follow. Within a month, most of their ground forces will be unable to walk. And if they go back to orbit, then they survive. But they cannot conquer a planet from orbit. They need ground troops, and their ground troops cannot survive here." Taeho opened his eyes and looked at the war map on the wall. Red dots marked Velshi positions across the globe. Blue dots marked human forces, scattered and outnumbered. But the red dots were not moving. They had not moved in almost a day. The Velshi advance had stalled, and now Taeho knew why. He stood up and addressed the room. "We do not need to destroy them," he said. "We do not need to match their weapons. We do not need a miracle. We need to keep them on the ground. We need to make them walk, make them fight, make them chase us. Every hour they spend on this planet, gravity does our work for us. We hold the line. We slow them down. We let Earth do what Earth does." A general at the far end of the table asked, "And what does Earth do?" Taeho looked at him. "It crushes things that were not built for it." Above them, in orbit, Rotan was receiving his first honest report. Sub-Commander Pillay stood before him with a datapad full of medical statistics. 40% of ground forces were reporting skeletal pain. 12% had confirmed fractures. 3 forward bases had requested emergency medical evacuations. Pillay recommended a pause in offensive operations to assess the situation. Rotan stared at him for a long moment and then said, "We have conquered 11 worlds. We will not be stopped by discomfort." He ordered a second wave of fresh troops to be sent to the surface immediately. Pillay bowed and left the bridge. He walked to his private quarters, sat down at his personal terminal, and stared at the screen for a very long time. He had read the medical data more carefully than Rotan had. He knew this was not discomfort. This was the planet itself rejecting them, pressing down on every cell of their bodies with a force they were never meant to endure. He also knew that the second wave would fail just like the first. Fresh troops would hit the surface strong and confident, and within 3 days they would be crawling. The math was simple, and it was merciless. On the surface, night fell over the Korean peninsula. Dohan's squad made camp in a bombed-out school building. Sujin cleaned her rifle by candlelight. Outside, the wind carried a sound that none of them had expected to hear from an alien army. Silence. No engines. No advance. Just the sound of an invasion force that had stopped moving, because it could no longer bear the weight of the world it had come to take. The new strategy spread across what remained of the global military network within hours. Taeho did not give it a fancy name. He called it exactly what it was. Make them stay and make them move. Every unit on every continent received the same set of simple orders. Do not let the Velshi rest. Do not let them retreat to their ships. Hit them at night. Hit them at dawn. Blow the roads behind them and the roads in front of them. Force them to walk. Force them to carry their wounded. Let gravity do the rest. It was not a strategy born from strength. Humanity was outgunned in every measurable way. The Velshi plasma weapons could cut through tanks. Their orbital ships could level a city in minutes. In a straight fight, on equal ground, the Velshi would have won easily. But the ground was not equal. The ground was Earth, and Earth was the heaviest habitable world the Velshi had ever set foot on. For the first time in 11 conquests, the battlefield itself was fighting against them. Doan understood the new orders better than most. He had been fighting like this already, not because anyone told him to, but because it was the only thing that worked. His squad had grown from 9 to 23, picking up scattered soldiers and armed civilians as they moved through the countryside south of Chowan. They slept in shifts, moved at night, and struck Velshi supply lines with homemade explosives and stolen military hardware. On the 7th night of the invasion, Doan's squad hit a Velshi supply convoy on a narrow road between two hills. There were 6 alien transport vehicles carrying food, medical supplies, and replacement parts for plasma weapons. The vehicles floated on anti-gravity lifts, but the Velshi soldiers guarding them were on foot. 5 of them were using their rifles as walking sticks. The ambush lasted less than 3 minutes. Dohan's squad destroyed 4 of the 6 transports with grenades and rifle fire. The Velshi guards tried to form a defensive line, but their movements were slow and painful. One alien turned to fire at a human position, and its knee buckled sideways with a sound like a branch snapping. It fell to the ground and did not get up. Another tried to take cover behind a vehicle and could not lower itself fast enough. Sujin put 2 rounds through its torso before it reached the ground. After the fight, Sujin examined the fallen aliens by flashlight. She had been doing this after every engagement, building a grim catalog of what Earth's gravity was doing to their bodies. The results were worse every time. Exoskeletons that should have been hard as stone were cracking along stress lines. Joints were swollen to twice their normal size. Internal organs had shifted downward inside their body cavities, compressed by weight they were never designed to bear. One alien that had been dead for less than 10 minutes already had blood pooling in its lower limbs, its weak heart unable to fight gravity, even in death. She reported her findings to Taeho's command through a relay radio. Taeho listened and said 2 words: keep pushing. While Do-hwan fought in the field, Ji-ho worked in a ruin. He was 17 years old, a second-year engineering student at a university that no longer existed. The campus had been hit by a Velshi orbital strike on the 2nd day. Most of the buildings were rubble. But the basement laboratory had survived, and Ji-ho had been living in it for a week, surrounded by broken equipment, salvaged alien technology, and a stubbornness that bordered on madness. The piece of alien technology that changed everything was a small anti-gravity module pulled from a crashed Velshi dropship. It was the size of a briefcase, smooth and dark, with no visible controls. Jiho had spent 3 days figuring out how it worked. The module generated a localized field that reduced the effect of gravity on objects within its range. The Velshi used these modules in their vehicles, their buildings, and even their armor, to make life on heavier worlds slightly more bearable. Jiho did not care about reducing gravity. He wanted to increase it. The principle was simple, even if the execution was not. The module manipulated gravitational fields in one direction. Jiho believed he could reverse the polarity and make it push the other way, amplifying gravity instead of reducing it. He worked for 4 days straight, sleeping only when his hands shook too much to hold tools. He burned through 3 car batteries and nearly electrocuted himself twice. On the 11th day of the invasion, he tested the prototype in the basement. He placed a 10-kilogram weight on a table, activated the device, and watched the weight crack the table in half and punch through the concrete floor. The device had increased local gravity by roughly 50%. For a human standing in the field, it would feel like carrying a heavy backpack, uncomfortable but survivable. For a Velshi, whose body was already failing under normal Earth gravity, it would be like dropping an anvil on every bone in their body. Jiho contacted Teiho's command through a chain of messengers and radio relays that took almost 2 days. When the message finally arrived, Teiho read it 3 times. Then he called Yuna. "Is this possible?" he asked. Yuna looked at the technical details Jiho had sent. "It is not just possible," she said. "It is brilliant. If we can produce these in quantity, we can create kill zones. Any Velshi unit that enters the field will be unable to move within minutes." "How many can we make?" "If we get him materials and people, dozens, maybe hundreds." Teiho gave the order. Within days, a network of underground workshops began producing Jiho's gravity amplifiers. They were ugly, bulky, unreliable machines held together with welding wire and desperation. But they worked. While Jiho built his weapons and Dohon bled the Velshi dry on the ground, Rotan made his final miscalculation. The second wave of fresh troops he had sent to the surface was already collapsing. Reports from every continent told the same story. New soldiers arrived strong and confident. Within 72 hours, they were limping. Within a week, they were breaking. The planet did not care how fresh they were. It pressed down on them all the same. Pillay presented the updated casualty figures to Rotan in a private meeting. Nearly half of all ground forces were now listed as combat ineffective. Not from human weapons, from gravity. From the simple, relentless, invisible weight of a world that was 3 times heavier than anything their species had ever known. "We must withdraw," Pillay said. "The mathematics are clear. We cannot hold this planet." Rotoan struck him across the face. "I have conquered 11 worlds," he said. "This rock will not be the exception." Pillay left the bridge with a bruise forming on his jaw and a decision forming in his mind. He walked to his quarters, opened a secure terminal, and began composing a message. It was short, and it was directed at Earth. It said, "Some of us wish to talk." Somewhere on the dark Korean countryside, Do-won sat on a hill and watched the distant glow of a Velshi base. It was quieter than it should have been. No patrols, no movement. Just lights in the darkness, flickering weakly, like a campfire burning down to ash. Sujin sat next to him. "They are not coming out anymore," she said. "No," Do-hwan agreed. "They are not." The wind blew cold across the hills. Above them, the stars were full of alien ships. Below them, the alien soldiers were full of broken bones. And between the stars and the ground, there was only gravity, patient and permanent, pressing down on everything that dared to stand on this ancient, heavy, unforgiving world. Pillay's message reached Earth on the 14th day of the invasion. It bounced through damaged communication relays, was picked up by a military listening post in Sejong, and was eventually decoded by Yuna in a cold basement room where she had been working without sleep for longer than she could remember. She read it 4 times, then sat very still for a long while. She called Taeho on the only secure line still working between Daejeon and Seoul. "One of their officers wants to negotiate," she said. Taeho was quiet for a moment. "It could be a trap." "It could be," Yuna agreed, "but look at their fleet movements." She sent him the orbital tracking data she had been collecting. The Velshi ships were repositioning, not into attack formations, but into evacuation patterns. Transport ships were moving closer to the surface. Combat cruisers were pulling back to higher orbit, or at least, some of them want to. Taeho studied the data. His instincts told him to be careful. His experience told him to wait. But the numbers told him something else entirely. The Velshi were breaking apart, not just physically, but as an organization. When an army starts planning its retreat, before its commander gives the order, the war is already over. The soldiers just do not know it yet. "Keep the channel open," he said, "but do not respond. Not yet. Let them wait, and let them wonder." He had a more immediate problem. Jiho's gravity amplifiers were ready, and Do-han's unit had been chosen to deploy them for the first time in actual combat. The Velshi were making one last push. Despite their deteriorating condition, Rotan had ordered a major offensive aimed at Daejeon, where he believed a human command center was located. He was half right. Yuna was there, but the command center was in Seoul, and the real threat to the Velshi was not in any building. It was in 3 ugly metal boxes being loaded onto a truck in the middle of the night. Do-han's squad, now numbering over 40 fighters, moved south to intercept the Velshi advance along a valley road that cut through the hills east of Daejeon. They arrived before dawn and placed the 3 gravity amplifiers at intervals along a 2-kilometer stretch of road. Jiho had come with them, insisting on calibrating the devices himself. He was thin and pale, and his hands were stained with engine grease and electrical burns. But his eyes were sharp, and his voice was steady. "When I turn them on, the effect radius is about 100 meters each," Jiho told Do-han. "Anything inside that radius will experience roughly 1.5 times normal Earth gravity. For us, it will feel bad. For them, it will feel like the end of the world." "How long do the batteries last?" Do-han asked. "Maybe 40 minutes. Then we make 40 minutes count." The Velshi column appeared at dawn, was the largest force Do-han had ever seen on the ground. Nearly 300 soldiers, supported by floating transport vehicles, and 4 heavy plasma artillery units. They moved slowly, painfully, like an army marching through deep water. Many of the soldiers in the rear were being helped along by their comrades. Some were being carried. The ones in front walked with grim determination, their exoskeletons dull and cracked, their weapons held in trembling hands. For a moment, Do-han felt something he did not expect. He felt sorry for them. They were soldiers following orders on a world that was slowly crushing them to death. They were in pain. They were afraid. They kept walking anyway. Then he remembered the orbital strikes that had destroyed cities. He remembered the millions who had died in the first 2 days. He remembered the flat, machine-translated voice that had demanded the surrender of his entire species. And the pity faded like morning fog. He gave the signal. The first amplifier activated when the front of the column was directly over it. The effect was instant and devastating. The lead Velshi soldiers dropped, as if invisible hands had grabbed them and slammed them into the earth. Exoskeletons shattered on impact. Legs buckled and snapped. Weapons fell from hands that could no longer hold them. The aliens did not even scream. They simply collapsed, folded under a weight that their bodies could not comprehend. The middle of the column tried to stop. The second amplifier caught them. Soldiers who had been struggling to walk at normal gravity now found themselves pinned to the ground, unable to rise, unable to crawl. Their floating vehicles, designed to resist the planet's natural pull, dipped and scraped against the road, their anti-gravity modules whining as they fought the amplified field. Two of them lost the battle entirely and crashed into the dirt, spilling supplies and wounded across the road. The rear of the column turned to flee. The third amplifier was behind them. Dowan's fighters opened fire from the hills on both sides. It was not a battle. It was something worse. The Velshi could not run, could not take cover, could not even raise their weapons. They lay on the ground in their cracked and broken armor, while human bullets and grenades fell among them. The plasma artillery units tried to fire, but their crews were pinned flat and could not operate the controls. One unit discharged into the ground by accident, melting a crater in the road. It was over in 20 minutes. The batteries still had time left, but there was nothing left to fight. Sujin walked through the aftermath with her medical kit and her rifle. She had seen bad things in this war. She had seen burned villages and dead children, and alien weapons that turned human bodies into ash. But this was different. The Velshi lay in piles, their thin bodies bent at wrong angles, their exoskeletons split open like eggshells. Many of them were still alive, their 4 eyes blinking slowly, their mouths opening and closing without sound. They could not move. Some of them could not breathe. The amplified gravity had compressed their lungs. She knelt beside one of them and looked into its alien face. It looked back at her with an expression she had no name for, but understood completely. It was the look of a creature that had realized, too late, that it had come to the wrong place. Sujin turned off her rifle's safety and then turned it back on. She reached into her kit, pulled out a painkiller injector, and pressed it against the alien's neck. She did not know if human medicine would work on Velshi biology, but the alien's breathing slowed, and its eyes stopped darting, and she thought, maybe it helped. The Battle of Daejeon broke the Velshi invasion. Reports of the gravity amplifiers spread across the globe within hours. Human forces everywhere began demanding the devices. Jiho worked without rest, transmitting schematics to every workshop and factory that still had power. Within a week, crude versions of the amplifiers were being deployed on every continent. Aboard the flagship, Rotan received the report from Daejeon. He read it in silence. His exoskeleton had turned a dull gray, a sign of extreme stress in Velshi physiology. His own body was deteriorating. Even the ship's artificial gravity, set to a level meant to prepare troops for Earth's surface, was slowly damaging him. His joints ached constantly. His vision blurred without warning. He was dying the same death as his soldiers, just more slowly. He looked at the report and made his decision. If he could not take the planet with soldiers, he would burn it from orbit. He ordered a full bombardment of every major human city. Pili refused to transmit the order. The bridge went silent. Every officer turned to look at the sub-commander, who stood with his datapad at his side, and his 4 eyes fixed on Rotan. "I will not transmit an order that serves only your pride," Pili said. His voice was calm, but his body trembled under the ship's gravity. "This invasion is over. Our soldiers are dying, not for victory, not for the expansion, for nothing." Rotan reached for the weapon at his side. Before his hand closed around it, 4 officers stepped between him and Pili. Then 6 more, then every officer on the bridge. Rotan looked at them all and saw the truth he had been refusing to see since the first day. He had lost. Not to human weapons, not to human tactics. He had lost to a number. 9.8 meters per second squared. The simple, stupid, unchangeable pull of a planet that did not know or care that the Velshi Empire existed. They restrained him gently. Even in mutiny, the Velshi were precise. Pele stepped to the main communication console and opened a channel to every frequency on Earth. His voice, translated by the same machine that had once demanded surrender, now said something very different. We yield. In the name of what remains of our expedition, we yield. The ceasefire took hold slowly, the way silence returns after a long storm. Not all at once, but in pieces. A gun stops firing here. An engine shuts down there. A soldier on one side lowers his weapon, and a soldier on the other side, if that broken creature could still be called a soldier, stops trying to stand. Tejo negotiated the terms from the bunker in Seoul, speaking through a translator program that Yuna had modified to work in both directions. The terms were simple, because complicated terms would have taken time, and the Velshi did not have time. They were dying on the surface faster than anyone had predicted. Yuna's original estimate of a month had been optimistic. The combination of constant combat, forced marches, and the gravity amplifiers had accelerated the damage beyond anything her models had accounted for. The agreement was this: the Velshi would withdraw all surviving ground forces and leave the solar system. They would take their dead. They would take their equipment. They would not return. In exchange, humanity would provide medical assistance to the thousands of Velshi soldiers who were too broken to reach the evacuation ships on their own. Some people were angry about that last part. There were voices in the command bunker and across the world that said the aliens deserved to die where they fell. They had destroyed cities. They had killed millions. They had come to enslave an entire species. Why should humanity carry them to safety? Tejo listened to those voices, and then he said, because we can. Because we are strong enough to fight them, and strong enough to carry them. And because the galaxy is watching, even if we cannot see the audience yet. Let them see what kind of species we are. The evacuation began 2 days after the ceasefire. Human soldiers, many of whom had been fighting the Velshi less than 48 hours earlier, were now loading alien wounded onto stretchers and carrying them to landing zones where Velshi shuttles waited. It was strange, uncomfortable work. The aliens were lighter than expected, their hollow bones and thin bodies weighing less than a human child in some cases. They were also terrified. Many of them had never been this close to a human without a weapon between them. They flinched at every touch, not from pain, but from fear. Dohwan was assigned to oversee the evacuation near Cherwan, the same hills where he had fought his first battle against the Velshi. His squad, now nearly 60 strong, worked alongside a medical team to process the alien wounded. There were hundreds of them, laid out in rows on the frozen ground, wrapped in thermal blankets that human medics had brought, because the Velshi could not regulate their body temperature under Earth's gravity. Dohwan walked down one of the rows and stopped beside a Velshi soldier whose exoskeleton had cracked down the center of its chest. The alien looked up at him with its 4 eyes, and Dohwan could see its organs moving faintly beneath the translucent shell. It was breathing in short, shallow gasps. It was dying. He bent down, slid his arms under the alien's body, and lifted it. It weighed almost nothing. He carried it across the field to the nearest shuttle, where a Velshi medic took it from him with hands that were shaking, whether from gravity or emotion. Dohwan could not tell. Sujin set up a field hospital next to the evacuation zone. She worked alongside 2 Velshi medics who had come down from orbit specifically to help with the wounded. Communication was difficult. They had no shared language, and the translator program only worked through a tablet that kept running out of battery. So they communicated the way medics have always communicated in war zones, by pointing, by demonstrating, by the universal language of hands trying to stop bleeding and bodies trying to stay alive. She showed them how to apply human splints to Velshi fractures. They showed her how to seal a cracked exoskeleton with a biological adhesive that hardened in seconds. By the end of the first day, they were working side by side without needing to speak at all. Sujin would later tell a journalist that she learned more about medicine in that one day than in 3 years of military training. Their bodies are completely different from ours, she said, but pain looks the same in every species. In orbit, Yuna boarded a neutral shuttle to meet Sub-Commander Pile face to face. The meeting took place in a small chamber, with gravity set to 0.5 g, a compromise that was uncomfortable for Yuna and agonizing for Pile. The Velshi officer was barely recognizable as a member of the tall, elegant species that had arrived in Earth's orbit less than 3 weeks ago. He was gaunt. His exoskeleton was gray and flaking. His joints were swollen, and he sat in a specially designed chair that supported his weight because his spine could no longer do it alone. He looked at Yuna with tired eyes and spoke through the translator. In 11 worlds, he said, no species fought back the way yours did. We had an advantage, Yuna said. Pile made a sound that the translator could not interpret. Yuna thought it might be a laugh. You call it an advantage, he said. We call it a death sentence. Your world is heavier than any habitable planet in our records. Your atmosphere is thick and violent. Your oceans are deep enough to crush our ships. Your biology is built on a scale that we did not think was possible for intelligent life. You do not just live on this world. You fight it every day of your lives, and you do not even notice. Yuna was quiet for a moment. Then she said, we did not choose this gravity. We just learned to live with it. Every species has to learn to live with what its world gives it. Pile looked at her for a long time. On every other world we conquered, he said, the people asked us why we came. You are the first species that showed us why we should not have. Jiho did not attend any of the official ceremonies or press events that followed the ceasefire. He was too busy. Within days of the surrender, he had shifted his work from building weapons to building tools. The Velshi anti-gravity technology, the same technology he had reversed to create the gravity amplifiers, could be used for things that had nothing to do with war. He designed a prototype rescue platform that could lift collapsed buildings off trapped survivors. He sketched plans for deep-sea exploration vehicles that could resist the crushing pressure of the ocean floor. He wrote equations for a construction system that could build structures in space without the limitations of Earth's gravity. A reporter from one of the few surviving news agencies found him in his basement laboratory, surrounded by alien components and empty coffee cups, and asked him how he felt about the role he had played in the war. Jiho thought about it for a while, and then said, they came here to take our world. They left us the tools to reach new ones. I think that is the best kind of victory. Rotan was taken back to Velshi space in restraints. Pile testified against him before the Velshi High Council, presenting the casualty figures, the medical reports, and the final cost of the invasion of Earth. The last image, transmitted from the Velshi flagship before it left the solar system, showed Rotan being escorted off the bridge by 2 guards. His legs were buckling, not from Earth's gravity this time, but from the weight of what he had done and failed to do. 6 months after the invasion, a joint human Velshi space station was completed in low Earth orbit. It was small, ugly, and held together with technology from 2 species that did not fully understand each other yet. But it worked. It hung in the darkness above the planet, and it worked. Tejo stood on the observation deck and looked down at Earth. The planet turned slowly below him, blue and white and heavy. Scars from the invasion were still visible, dark patches where cities had burned, gray smudges where orbital strikes had scorched the land. But there was green too, and light, and the small bright dots of ships moving between the surface and the station. He thought about the 11 worlds the Velshi had conquered before Earth. He had read the reports Pile had shared during the negotiations. Those worlds were gentle places. Thin atmospheres, low gravity, mild climates, soft ground. Their people were intelligent and creative and kind, and they had been completely unprepared for violence on the scale the Velshi brought. They had surrendered because they had no reason to believe they could fight. Earth was not a gentle place. Earth had crushing gravity, violent storms, freezing winters, burning summers, earthquakes, volcanoes, floods, droughts, and predators in every corner of every ecosystem. Humanity had not evolved in comfort. It had evolved in a war against its own planet, a war that never ended, a war that had made human bones dense and human muscles strong, and human hearts powerful enough to pump blood uphill against a force that would flatten any Velshi who tried to stand in it. The Velshi had looked at Earth's radio signals and seen a primitive species on a small, unremarkable world. They had not understood what they were really seeing. They were seeing a species that had been fighting gravity since the first fish crawled out of the ocean. A species that had learned to stand upright on a world that wanted everything to stay down. A species that built towers and climbed mountains and launched itself into space on pillars of fire, not because it was easy, but because nothing on Earth had ever been easy, and they had learned to do impossible things anyway. Tejo smiled, just slightly, and pressed his hand against the cold glass of the observation window. Somewhere out there, 11 conquered worlds were hearing the story of what happened on Earth. The story of a species that did not just survive its own planet, but thrived on it. And when the conquerors came, the planet fought back, and so did its people. The stars above the station were cold and silent. They had been watching for a very long time. Now, for the first time, something on this small, heavy world was watching back, and it was not afraid.